So let's talk about an author's reader, specifically how to write towards a reader. I find that oftentimes writers today tend to assume that their reader is, I guess for a lack of a better word, dumb. And if you notice, like the writing today is often geared towards someone who's easily distracted, who needs some sort of interesting thing to always happen to keep them absorbed to the page, always this fear of being boring. And when authors write with that type of fear and that sort of mentality towards readers, what they're doing basically is you're running towards a moronic audience, right? You use simple words, you use the exciting plots, the twists and the turns to hold your audience's attention. So, what I would suggest instead is to stop thinking that your reader is dumb. But before we get into anything more in detail, just stop considering your reader to be a dumb individual, and stop worrying that your reader won't take a chance on your piece, that they won't kind of slog through maybe a section that might be boring. For example, I would stop with the insecurity first before getting into more of the ways to deal with the reader. I mean, look at many classic works of literature, right? I mean, so many classics are classics and are considered beloved because the writing is full of implication, it's full of inferences, it's full of cleverness, wordplay, puns. The writing isn't spelt out just for the reader. And in fact, readers love these stories because they are so difficult. Just imagine Shakespeare written in plain English today, just written as someone today would write with no puns, no wordplay. It would be so boring you would not enjoy the story. So before going further, I'm trying to make a case that you need to assume that you can trust your reader. Trust that they will stick with you, and trust that you don't need to overawe them to keep their interest. Now, in regards to what you owe your reader, what you as the author must do, I think you only really owe them two things, right? You owe them the payoff to your promise, right? The payoff to what you've promised them in the story, and you owe them clarity in your writing. Ambiguity basically is what's going to probably kill reader interest more than anything else. And I can go over that more in a separate video. But for now, I would, when it comes to considering readers, stick with that. Stick with making sure that your payoff, matches your premise, and make sure that your writing is clear. Now, admittedly, I'm speaking from the position of someone that I don't necessarily care too much for my reader. And what I mean by that is, think of all of these classic artists, right? Do you think that Mozart composed with an audience in mind? Do you think Van Gogh painted wondering what his audience would be thinking of his work? And I suppose they probably did in some general context, but they only cared really for the clarity of their work, to make sure that what they were intending to create actually came to fruition. Mozart didn't compose an opera for a moronic audience, then composed another opera for a more bourgeois class. The work was the same. If it was too difficult to comprehend, then forget those audience members. If it was too boring, then forget them. It kind of goes back to, I guess, a similar quote of Mozart, the famous story when I think it was the king of Prussia there had said something to the effect of his piece had too many notes in it, and he had replied it has exactly the number of notes it needs. You need to be clear towards them, but not so over engaged that you need your audience to love your work. If they accept it, fine, but if not, that is also fine. Now, I'm not speaking from the position of being egotistical. I'm not saying you're doing your own writing for your own vanity, right? That's Whenever one sets out to do vanity projects, you end up with films like The Room, right? Right, where a guy is just doing this project because he wants to without any other considerations besides just his own appeasement. You do have an audience, and they do have their limitations, so you should consider that. A children's writer can't pen a 400,000 word novel with a college level vocabulary. And similarly, someone that perhaps is a genre writer, say horror, for example, right? A horror writer can reference tropes from, say, horror films and from other mediums because he assumes his audience's familiarity, right? So your audiences have limitations and they do have their own background knowledge coming into it. And yes, for your piece, you would want to know that before writing it. But once you know your audience's limitations and their background knowledge, that's where it ends. I remember back when I first started and wanted to become a writer, I ended up reading Stephen King's book on writing, where he spoke of an ideal reader, that you as the author should be writing towards this one particular reader. And I think it can help to have that in mind, to, like I was mentioning before, to know their limitations, to know their background, to know probably what their general interests may be. It can be helpful. But your goal when it comes to readers really is just to write for clarity towards them and to really keep your story's premise and promise. If you can do that, I believe that's really all you ever owe your reader.